Right, good morning. I've got 20 minutes of some of the gorier topics. Look, the reality is, and just to put this right up front as well, this is a particular case scenario. Zululand is an area where snaring is quite prevalent, but there's a lot of cooperation, particularly with the guys at Mkuzi Game Reserve. So a lot of this information and the photographs come from the folks at Mkuzi Game Reserve, and my particular interest is obviously from a wild dog background, and Mkuzi Game Reserve is a particularly important reserve for wild dogs. You can just see here, these are reserves that have got wild dogs, and you can see how important Mkuzi is in terms of linking a lot of those properties together. So we have been working with those guys for quite a number of years. This should highlight some of the issues that they're dealing with. It's a lot of challenges, there's an incredible amount of committed staff there, but it's something that's going to carry on for a little while, and there's quite a lot of options that people can take in terms of trying to reduce these problems. So there's a demand for bushmeat amongst the communities that are there. And there's a lot of talk that it's just subsistence. The reality is that there's quite a big commercial aspect to it as well. There are people that are trading according to demand. And there's also a high density of communities that are bordering on Mkuzi Game Reserve. If you just have a look at this picture, that's the Mkuzi River going up the middle there. On the eastern side is the KwaZulu community. On the western side is Mkuzi Game Reserve. So you can see it is quite transformed. And although there probably are some solutions that can be dealt with, it is quite a tricky situation for that reserve. There is always going to be a huge human pressure on that boundary. Then there's just some other aspects of it. There's a low employment rate. There's very little opportunity for a lot of people there. People are bored. It's entertainment. It's a form of income. There's all sorts of aspects like that. There are pockets of wealth now that are developing in some areas like Jozini, where there's actually a higher demand for bushmeat than there was previously because people can now afford to pay for it. Boredom, as I've said, is an issue. And then there's a preference for snaring over rifles and dogs. It's just one of the cultural aspects of some of the communities there where they do prefer those. That's just the reality of it. It's something that the guys have to deal with on the ground. And then obviously amongst the different tribal authorities, and there's 4 of those that border on Mkuzi Game Reserve, there's differing opinions towards the reserve. Some are a lot more cooperative with the reserve than others. Some are more amenable to cooperating with the management of the reserve than others. And these are all factors that play into the seriousness. And then obviously there's just intense snaring that goes on in this reserve. And the reality is that it results in a whole lot of death of animals and a lot of maiming of animals as well. It's something that doesn't often get taken into consideration, the amount of wounded animals that get left behind. Some more gory pictures. I mean, this is just the reality of it. A lot of this doesn't make it into the media. Things like rhino poaching, it's a huge issue, but it does make it into a much higher profile than snaring. Snaring is something that a lot of people are dealing with in a number of game reserves, not just even in KZN, all over the country and elsewhere as well. These are just some of the epic wounds, and these obviously have other costs apart from the fact that there's just a massive welfare implication. Some of the costs, obviously the maiming and mutilation and death of general species, but also when it comes to some of the more concerted efforts towards endangered species, it's a wild dog on the left-hand side, on your right, and then also black rhino as well. I mean, these have got massive implications to these animals. An enormous amount of money and time is put into trying to conserve these animals. In terms of wild dogs, from what we see, snaring is probably going to be the one situation that does actually stop wild dogs taking root in Mkuzi and that whole area. Then there's the financial costs. The reality is that in 2011, it cost 385,000 rands worth of game that was killed. That's just killed by snares. That's not taking into account animals that weren't found, animals that were maimed. There have been other cases where obviously you have black rhino taken into account, and all of a sudden that number just soars dramatically. There's a huge financial cost implication to this. There's also financial cost of veterinary intervention. There's security initiatives. People are acting on intelligence. Field rangers have to go out. Field rangers are limited to the amount of hours that they're allowed to work according to legal unions. They're working on tip-offs. There's a lot of implications. It affects the whole way the management is actually structured. And then obviously there's intensive case management. Mkuzi is one of the few reserves that have got a case manager that pushes cases the whole way through the system. That does take money. It takes time. If you just look at the cost of a snare removal from a black rhino in 2010, helicopter cost 33,000 rand. Overall, that costs 45,000 rand to remove a snare from a black rhino. When you start adding a couple of those cases together and the financial pressure that a lot of the organizations are under to keep these situations going, you can see how it's getting incredibly tricky to be able to handle those situations. Obviously, there's a negative publicity. I mean, I've heard several cases where the managers have been told of animals that are caught in snares. There's a perception that the management aren't doing enough. There's a perception that the management are perhaps incompetent. There's all these kind of perceptions when an animal is seen with a snare in it. The reality is that nobody sees how many snares are taken off. Nobody sees how much work is going into actually trying to get it down to that level. And then there's also this. There's a lot of attention put on particular communities where there's a community that is seen to be essentially poaching more than other communities. So it means that the communities that are poaching more are getting more efforts diverted towards them. They're getting more soccer tournaments, for example. They're getting more educational opportunities, more tours into the game reserve. You get communities that are actually quite compliant with the reserve. They're cooperating very well with management. A lot of those benefits are actually being diverted from them to try and pacify other areas which are a lot more aggressive. And some of the implications are as well that there's not enough law enforcement going on. There is an enormous amount of law enforcement. There's a huge amount of commitment going on the ground. Although they are short-staffed to some extent, you can see the number of arrests that have been made over the years there. There's quite a lot of arrests. You see there's a lot of snares that have been removed, and those have been increasing over time as well. So even though the efforts are becoming more stringent, the problem's not necessarily going away. And you can just see some of the difficulties. That photograph on the side there, that's a snare line. It's quite tricky when guys are coming in. You've got 10 poachers coming in, setting 10 snares apiece. That's potentially 100 snares set in all sorts of different paths. To try and remove all those different snares, it's very tricky. They could remove 90% of those snares, but then you've still got a couple of snares that are sitting around waiting. They disappear over time. Some of them might get taken. Some of them might rust. Eventually they end up on an animal. Then there's obviously the law enforcement side. The difficulties in a place like Mkuzi Game Reserve. It's quite a flat area, so there's not that many opportunities for OPs. You've got very experienced poachers. It's part of entertainment for some folks. They're getting mentored by older poachers. There's staff vacancies. There's obviously skills shortages amongst the police. There are situations where they've got incredibly cooperative police, particularly Mkuzi Police Station, but you've got police that aren't necessarily trained in all the aspects of law enforcement. So you're finding situations where, for example, evidence is pointed out, it gets through to court, but it wasn't following exact procedures, and that causes cases then thrown out. So although there's the will, there's not necessarily always the skills that are following that up. Proving possession beyond doubt has been very difficult for some of the management in there when they get to a muzi and they find that there might be a wild dog or something like that that's actually outside the boundary fence of a particular kraal. It's very difficult for the guys to point out and associate that meat with that particular individual, so those cases are thrown out. There's a heavy caseload for prosecutors, and those are not prosecutors that are dedicated necessarily to wildlife crimes. They're dealing with rape, murder, theft, all sorts of other things as well. And wildlife crime is often seen as a minor issue. There's a lack of dedicated wildlife crime prosecutors, so you're getting guys that are getting their caseloads completely swamped. And then one of the biggest issues, even though the case is going through, it's getting through to a prosecution case, the judge before sentencing is not waiting to actually find out if that person's got a prior conviction at all. So a lot of people are getting convicted as first-time offenders. So obviously those sentences are a lot lower than they could be if somebody had found that this person had been poached 2 or 3 times before, had all sorts of other issues. A lot of the cases are juvenile cases, so a lot of them are simply referred to a diversion program. There's no law enforcement at all, and those then become repeat offenders. A lot of cases have been suspended as well. There's been an enormous amount of suspended cases, and this is partly because there's issues with filling up jails. There's bigger issues. The jails are full with other criminals. Wildlife crime is not seen as a problem. Let them out. And then there's just very little political will. Up until recently, it hasn't been a big issue, certainly nationally. There's actually very recently, in fact this last week, been a SADC conference where this has been raised to that sort of level. It's fantastic. It really is something that needs to be done. Then obviously there are positives. A place like Mkuzi Game Reserve, they've got very experienced field rangers. Excellent guys. They've made a lot of arrests. There's good intelligence network. There's a lot of information coming through to people. There's good police cooperation, as I mentioned earlier. And then there's obviously the case manager. That's a huge, huge bonus. You've got a person that can take that case from the start and push it through and drive it through with the prosecutors, develop a relationship with folks that are in the legal fraternity, and try and get some sort of an issue resolved. Then obviously there's just an enormous amount of these. I've got 2 slides of this. It's not to try and work through every single one of these. It's just to give an indication that when people say, well, perhaps the community is not being engaged by the reserve management or the community education officer, there's an enormous amount of liaison that's actually going on. There are resources that are going in from the reserve itself. There are people being brought into the reserves. It's just a case of greater cooperation amongst the folks. This just gives an idea as well. This is part of the work that Endangered Wildlife Trust was doing through our community liaison officers, which was particularly geared at wild dogs. There was also, this is just streams of lists of things where people are being engaged. There is certainly knowledge going on out there, but obviously there's a lot more social issue that's behind a lot of this, as opposed to what folks have said. You can educate people, you can take them and show them, but if there's other issues that are compounding it, it's going to be very tricky to solve. And then there's the meat issue. A lot of talk has been thrown around, certainly sort of aimed at the reserve management. Well, why don't you supply more meat to the communities, and that should keep everybody happy. But the reality is that the reserve is a fenced, confined area. 37,000 hectares, and there's a limited capacity to supply meat to people. there's got to be an ecological balance met. There are scavengers in the reserve. As guys have mentioned, vultures are priority species there. There are others there. There are wild dogs in that reserve. There are cheetahs in that reserve as well. And there has to be a bit of an ecological balance struck. You can't just keep plundering a system. Eventually there's not going to be anything left. So, I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of cognizance taken into that, and the scientific community within KwaZulu Wildlife does a huge amount of research and thought that goes into what numbers are actually going to be taken off. There's also pressure to reach financial targets. Every reserve is stressed. I know there are difficulties, particularly in places where the budgets are tight. Guys have to meet shortfalls, and they've got to be able to take avenues where they can use their meat and they can generate that money. In this case, 2012, there were 200 Nyala that were going to be taken off live, which will be for sales. That obviously generates revenue. 250 Impala, that also generates revenue. In terms of dead animals, 245 Nyala and 400 Impala. And those sales go to various avenues. Obviously, you've got to keep staff happy as well. There are some sales to staff. There's sales to public avenues. So whether you go to a butchery, which will pay a higher price, as opposed to the communities next door, you're going to generate more money by selling it to the butcher. So there's a temptation, if you're going to generate revenue, to obviously go to the person who's going to pay a higher price per kg for meat. Then obviously there are meat sales to the neighbours. But those are also quite restricted by things like the Meat Sales Act, things like that. It's quite difficult to keep the actual balance going. Donations as well. There are donations of Impala to various Amakosi, to different occasions. Obviously, as I mentioned before, you've got 4 tribal authorities. It's quite tricky to balance it out. There's a lot of people around there. If you've got a couple of hundred animals that are being sold off each year, when you start splitting that down to each tribal authority, down to each Induna level, you end up having 1 or 2 animals per area, which over a period of a year is not really going to cover that. Then obviously there's predator baits, things like that in terms of actual management activities that the reserves need to engage in. And then there's the hunting quotas as well. That's also something that's going to generate money. Because he does have a hunting area in it, and that is something that's critical to keeping that reserve going in terms of revenue generation. And then our CEO sent us around a little while back, and I think it really does go to show, a lot of people talk, and there's a huge amount of effort that goes in towards countering this, and you can see from a management aspect, from a community liaison aspect, from a law enforcement aspect. But the reality is that it's going to take a huge number of solutions. I'm not going to give them all to you now. People like Dennis Kelly at the reserve, Dave Robertson as a manager, they have got various proposals, and it does involve more community engagement. It involves employment, things like that. But it's those kind of issues that are going to have to be looked at, because it actually can't carry on going like it is. It really is just not going to solve itself.